My cousin wore a white veil to my engagement party, made a toast about my fiancé, almost dating her, and then crashed my honeymoon to beg for money. When I told her no, she laughed and said, "Oh, come on, you can't let family starve in a foreign country." I just walked away. That was 11 months ago. This morning, she was let out of court in handcuffs. My cousin has a long history of hijacking my events and making everything about herself. She then crashed my honeymoon to borrow money, so I left her stranded. I have a cousin, Hannah, who is the human version of a pop-up ad. Annoying, invasive, and always showing up when you least want her to. She has this uncanny ability to insert herself into other people's moments, twist the situation to her advantage, and somehow make herself the victim if you dare call her out. The first time I really noticed her behavior was at my engagement party. It was supposed to be an intimate backyard celebration with family and a few close friends. Hannah arrived 40 minutes late, wearing a floor-length white dress with a veil. She said it was a joke and that she was celebrating the bride vibe. Throughout the night, she made little digs like, "Are you sure you want to marry so young?" and "It's not too late to back out." She even clinked her glass mid-toast to share a story about how my fiancé almost dated her in high school, which was completely made up. The second time she pulled something was on my 30th birthday. I'd booked a nice restaurant and prepaid for a set menu for my friends. Hannah showed up with 3 people I didn't know, claiming they were mutual friends and wouldn't eat much. She then ordered the most expensive drinks for the entire table and stuck me with the bill. When I called her out later, she said, "It's your birthday. Don't be so uptight about money." But the most bizarre stunt came last year. I had posted about running a 10K race for charity, and on the day of the event, Hannah showed up at the starting line in a full running outfit. She told everyone she had been training for months and inspired me to join. She even ran the first kilometer, then faked an ankle injury and got herself carried to the finish line by volunteers, taking photos the whole way and posting captions like, "Pushed through the pain for the cause." She collected donations from her friends, and I'm still not sure if the money ever made it to the charity. By this point, I had learned one crucial thing. If Hannah knew about an event in my life, she would try to make it hers. So when my husband and I planned our honeymoon, a 2-week trip to Italy, I didn't post about it online, didn't tell anyone outside my immediate family, and kept the dates vague. Apparently that wasn't enough. On our 3rd day in Florence, we were eating breakfast in a small cafe when I heard that unmistakable voice behind me. "Oh my God, fancy seeing you here." I turned around, and there she was, Hannah, wearing oversized sunglasses and grinning like she'd just won a prize. I asked her what on earth she was doing in Italy, and she launched into a story about how she just happened to be traveling through Europe at the same time. But within 5 minutes, she dropped the real reason. She'd run into some financial trouble and needed to borrow a few €100 to tide her over until her flight home. I told her flatly, "No, this is our honeymoon. I'm not here to lend you money." She laughed and said, "Oh, come on. You can't let family starve in a foreign country." Then she looked at my husband and added, "She's always been dramatic about money, hasn't she?" I tried to walk away, but she followed us out of the cafe. She claimed her hotel had messed up her reservation, and she had nowhere to stay. My husband, being much kinder than me, suggested we help her find a budget place for the night, but she insisted that it would be safer if she stayed with us. I said no again. That's when she really turned up the manipulation. She started crying in the middle of the street, saying we were abandoning her, that she knew we'd changed since getting married, and that she was just trying to keep family close. People were staring. My husband was uncomfortable. I was furious. We managed to walk away, but that night, while we were having dinner, Hannah texted me saying she'd found the perfect compromise. She'd booked herself a seat on the train we were taking to Venice the next morning so we could spend more time together. She even sent a photo of her ticket. That's when I decided I was done playing nice. I texted her back, "Sure, meet us at the station at 10 a.m. She showed up the next morning with 2 massive suitcases and an attitude like she was joining us for a group holiday. She was bragging about all the things she wanted to do in Venice and how romantic it would be to explore together. Here's what she didn't know. I had already called the train company the night before and changed our tickets to a different train, one leaving an hour earlier. We boarded without her. She called me 6 times while we were on the train, leaving voicemails that started off fake cheerful. "Hey, I think I missed you guys at the station," and quickly turned hostile. "You're seriously ditching me? That's cold." Then came the text, "Fine, I'll just meet you at your hotel." Too bad she didn't know where we were staying. By the time she figured out we weren't going to wait for her, she was stuck with 2 huge suitcases, a non-refundable ticket for a train she missed, and no clue where to go. I heard from another cousin later that she spent hours at the station trying to find us, then ended up paying an outrageous last-minute rate for a dingy hotel. My husband and I spent the rest of our honeymoon in peace. No surprise pop-ups, no guilt trips, no Hannah. When we got back home, she tried to spin the story to the family, saying we had abandoned her overseas. 3 days later, I was sitting on my couch scrolling through my phone when it basically exploded with notifications. Hannah had posted a massive Instagram story with 47 slides called "Abandoned in Florence, a Family Betrayal," and it was everywhere. She'd included crying selfies at the train station and screenshots of her texts to me with extra ones I'd never seen before. Jake came over and looked at my phone while we scrolled through the comments together. Our wedding guests were writing things like, "I can't believe you'd do this," and distant relatives I hadn't talked to in years were calling me heartless. Someone had already started a GoFundMe called "Help Hannah Get Home Safely," and it had raised $800 in just 2 hours. My phone started ringing, and it was Mom with her voice all shaky, asking if it was true that I'd left Hannah crying and alone in a foreign country with no money. I could hear Aunt Diane screaming in the background about pressing charges for abandonment, which didn't even make sense. I tried to explain about Hannah crashing our honeymoon and demanding money from us, but Mom cut me off saying Hannah told her she was just trying to surprise us for our special day. She said I'd deliberately given Hannah the wrong train time, which was technically true, but not the whole story. Jake took the phone from me and calmly told Mom about the white dress dress at our engagement party, and the birthday dinner bill and the fake charity run. Mom just said that family helps family regardless of past mistakes, which made my stomach drop. After Jake hung up, we just sat there in stunned silence because we knew Hannah would spin this, but the speed and scale of her campaign was overwhelming. Jake asked if we should respond publicly, but I was too exhausted to even think straight about what to do. Then Sophie called, and she was really upset because as my maid of honor, she'd been tagged in Hannah's posts and was getting harassed by random people. She told me Hannah was claiming I'd promised to pay for her Europe trip as a wedding gift and then reneged on it. Sophie forwarded me screenshots of Hannah's elaborate lies, including fake text conversations that never happened. I decided to check our joint bank account and discovered Hannah had disputed the hotel charge from Florence through her credit card company. She was claiming we'd agreed to pay for her room, and now there was a $400 hold freezing funds we needed for our mortgage payment. Around 10 that night, someone started pounding on our door, and it was Aunt Diane demanding we reimburse Hannah's emergency flight home that supposedly cost $2,000. She was filming the entire confrontation on her phone, saying it was for evidence of our cruelty, which was completely insane. Jake firmly told Diane to leave, but she planted herself on our porch and started loudly telling neighbors walking by that we were trust fund babies who abandoned a family member in crisis. I finally threatened to call the police, and she left, but not before posting the video online with more lies about us. I barely slept that night, checking my phone every few minutes as Hannah's video spread across Facebook and Instagram like wildfire. By morning, it had over 2,000 views and hundreds of comments from people I'd never met calling me heartless and cruel. Jake made coffee while I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the damage, my stomach too twisted to even think about food. That's when I saw it. Hannah had started a GoFundMe called Help Me Recover from Family Abandonment Trauma, with a goal of $5,000. The description painted her as a victim of calculated emotional abuse who needed therapy for PTSD and medical treatment for panic attacks she'd suffered since Italy. She'd posted a photo of herself in a hospital bed with an IV drip, looking pale and fragile. The fundraiser had already hit $3,000 in donations from sympathetic strangers and distant relatives who'd never heard our side. My hand started shaking so bad I dropped my phone on the table. Jake picked it up and his face went white when he saw the amount. We both knew this had gone way beyond family drama. My boss texted me asking if I needed time off to deal with family issues because he'd seen the post through mutual connections on LinkedIn. 3 coworkers had already messaged asking if I was okay and offering support in that awkward way people do when they've heard gossip but don't want to seem nosy. What's really going on with Hannah tracking them down in Florence? She says she just happened to be traveling through Europe but immediately needs money. That timing seems awfully convenient for someone who supposedly planned a whole European trip. Sophie showed up at our door an hour later with her laptop and a determined look on her face. She worked as a paralegal and knew how to document things properly for potential legal action. We spent the morning screenshotting every post, comment, and donation on the GoFundMe before Hannah could delete anything. But when we went back to find her original post from the week before where she'd mentioned following us to Italy, they were already gone. She'd scrubbed her timeline clean of anything that made her look bad. Sophie started making a timeline of events with timestamps and links while I tried to focus on work emails, but I couldn't concentrate on anything except the growing disaster online. 3 days passed in a blur of damage control and sleepless nights. Jake's parents called from Florida completely confused and concerned. Hannah had somehow gotten their phone number and spent over an hour on the phone with them spinning tales about how I'd always been jealous of her success and beauty, how this whole Italy thing was calculated revenge for her being prettier and more popular. Jake's mom didn't believe it, but his dad seemed unsure, asking Jake if maybe we could have handled things differently. The doubt in his voice made Jake slam his fist on the counter hard enough to rattle the dishes. I couldn't take it anymore and decided to write my own Facebook post with just the facts. I kept it simple and measured, explaining that Hannah had crashed our honeymoon uninvited, demanded money, and we'd simply taken an earlier train to have our vacation in peace. Within minutes of posting, Hannah's friends swarmed the comments like angry wasps. They called me a liar, a gaslighter, a narcissist projecting my own issues. One woman wrote a whole paragraph about how abusers always try to flip the narrative and make themselves the victim. I deleted the post after an hour, but screenshots were already circulating. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Robert that made my blood run cold. He wrote that he was disappointed in how Jake had influenced me, that Hannah was consulting lawyers about defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and we should prepare ourselves for legal action. Jake threw his phone across the room where it hit the wall and cracked the screen. Mom called again that evening, her voice shaky with tears as she begged me to just apologize to keep the peace. She said Hannah had already spent the GoFundMe money on therapy sessions and medical bills from her panic attacks, that the family was being torn apart, that Grandma Rose was having chest pains from the stress. I told her I wouldn't apologize for protecting my honeymoon, but she just cried harder and said I didn't understand how bad things were getting. That night, Jake held me while I sobbed into his chest, ugly crying about how half my family thought I was cruel and heartless. He kept repeating that we did nothing wrong, stroking my hair and trying to comfort me, but it didn't feel like enough when my own relatives were choosing Hannah's lies over the truth. The next morning, Sophie called with excitement in her voice. She'd been digging through the metadata on Hannah's hospital photo and discovered it was actually from 2019. After some more searching, she found that the medical documentation Hannah was sharing about her panic attacks was from when she'd been treated for alcohol poisoning after a college party years ago. Sophie had screenshots proving the dates didn't match up with Hannah's current claims. I was going through my photos from Florence to find more evidence when I stumbled across something I'd completely forgotten about. Jake had been taking a video of the beautiful architecture when Hannah showed up at the cafe. The video caught her in the background saying clearly to me that she saw my mom's Facebook post about Florence and booked a flight to surprise us. My mom's post post that I'd specifically asked her not to make, but she did anyway with a photo of us at the airport captioned, "So proud of my daughter, heading to Florence for her honeymoon." I sent the video to Mom and Aunt Diane that same night. Mom didn't respond for 3 hours. Aunt Diane texted back in 10 minutes claiming we'd edited the footage and that Hannah was obviously joking about the surprise part. She sent 12 more messages about how we were bullying her daughter and twisting innocent words. Jake sat next to me on the couch watching my phone light up with each new text. I blocked Aunt Diane's number after she started sending screenshots of Hannah's old Facebook posts about mental health awareness. Mom finally called around midnight and just said she needed time to process everything. A week passed and the constant messages from Hannah's friends had slowed down to maybe 2 or 3 a day. They kept saying I'd ruined her mental health and triggered her abandonment issues from childhood. One of them sent me a long email about how I needed to pay for Hannah's therapy sessions. I deleted it without responding. My phone rang on Thursday afternoon and Grandma Rose's name appeared on the screen. She told me she'd been watching Hannah pull these stunts since she was 12 years old. She said not to apologize for anything and mentioned she was changing her will that week. Hannah wasn't getting a penny from her anymore. I thanked her and felt some relief knowing at least one family member saw through Hannah's act. That relief disappeared fast when Sophie texted me a link 2 days later. Hannah had started a blog called Surviving Family Trauma, and our honeymoon was the first post. She'd written 3,000 words about being abandoned in a foreign country by cruel family members. The post already had over 200 shares in various toxic family support groups. I scrolled through the comments and people were calling me a monster. Jake came home from work the next day looking pale. His boss had called him into HR that morning. Someone had sent them Hannah's Instagram stories and blog posts claiming Jake was complicit in elder abuse. Hannah had changed her story and now claimed she was vulnerable due to an unnamed disability. The HR manager showed Jake printed screenshots of everything. Jake had to explain the whole situation while the HR manager took notes. Sophie drove over that night and went straight into lawyer mode. She started drafting a cease and desist letter while Jake documented everything from the HR meeting. She said Hannah had crossed the line from family drama into threatening our jobs, and we needed to protect ourselves legally. I checked Hannah's blog again while Sophie typed and found a new development. She was now selling merchandise with quotes like, "I survived abandonment in Florence," printed on t-shirts and mugs. My wedding photo had been edited to put devil horns on my head and used as the background image. The shop already showed 17 sales. Mom called me the next morning and finally admitted she was starting to see a pattern with Hannah's behavior. She said she felt caught in the middle but revealed something I didn't know. Hannah owed her $5,000 from various emergencies over the years that were never paid back. Mom had been keeping track in a notebook and showed me photos of each entry. Sophie sent the cease and desist letter through certified mail that afternoon. Hannah received it 2 days later and immediately posted the entire document on her blog. She claimed we were trying to silence a victim and started using the hashtag #JusticeForHannah on every platform. Local Facebook groups picked it up and it started trending in Chicago within hours. My phone rang yesterday morning with an unknown number. A reporter from a Chicago lifestyle blog wanted my side of the story that was apparently captivating the city. She said Hannah had given them an exclusive interview and they wanted to be fair by including my perspective. I hung up without answering her questions. Sophie called me 10 minutes later and told me not to talk to any reporters at all. She said staying quiet would make it blow over faster, but she was wrong. Hannah went on 3 different podcasts that week talking about toxic family members and narcissistic relatives. She told stories that never even happened, like claiming I once stole her college acceptance letter and hid it so she couldn't go to her dream school. She said I sabotaged her wedding dress fitting by telling the seamstress to make it 2 sizes too small. She even claimed I put laxatives in her birthday cake when she was 16. None of it was true, but thousands of people believed every word. Jake and I couldn't even go to Target anymore without someone recognizing us. Yesterday, a woman walked right up to me in the cereal aisle and said loud enough for everyone to hear that I was the one who abandoned my disabled cousin in Italy. I left my cart full of groceries and walked out while people stared and whispered. Jake had it worse at his office where coworkers kept asking if the stories were true. 3 days later, Uncle Robert forwarded me an email by accident that was meant for Aunt Diane. Hannah had written to him admitting she was making some things up for sympathy, but said it was justified because we humiliated her at that train station. She actually wrote that she deserved compensation for the emotional damage we caused by not letting her crash our honeymoon. Uncle Robert added a note at the top saying he thought we should just pay her to make this go away. 3 weeks had passed since we got back from Italy, and I'd lost 8 pounds from not being able to eat. Jake started taking sleeping pills because he'd lie awake all night reading the comments on Hannah's posts. Our beautiful honeymoon felt like it happened to different people in a different lifetime. This nightmare Hannah created had replaced every good memory from our trip. Then Hannah filed a small claims court case against us for $5,000. Sophie bringing her paralegal skills to document Hannah's lies shows someone finally understands that fighting crazy requires receipts, not reason. Hannah deleting her posts about following them to Italy proves she knows exactly what she's doing. Guilty people always clean up their digital footprints first. The paperwork listed emotional distress, emergency travel costs in Florence, and therapy bills from the trauma of being abandoned. She even itemized $150 for the suitcases she claimed we made her buy. Sophie spent hours going through Hannah's GoFundMe page and found something interesting. Hannah had raised money saying she needed to get home from Italy, but the dates showed she'd already been back for 2 days when she started it. Sophie reported it to GoFundMe and they froze the $23,000 pending investigation. Hannah lost her mind when she found out the money was frozen. She posted everywhere that Jake and I had conspired with GoFundMe to steal money from her supporters. She started a new fundraiser on a different site asking for donations for legal fees to fight her abusers, which she said was us. People actually donated another $8,000 in 48 hours. Mom tried to fix things by inviting just Jake and me over for dinner the next week. She promised it would be just the three of us, and we could talk about how to handle everything. We showed up to find Aunt Diane already there with a stack of printed blog posts that she threw on the table. She kept pointing at them and demanding I admit the truth about what really happened. Mom tried to calm her down, but Diane kept getting louder, saying we were destroying Hannah's life with our lies. That's when Mom finally snapped and told Diane that Hannah had been lying to everyone for years. She brought up the fake cancer scare, the stolen wedding money, and every other scam Hannah had pulled. Diane stood up so fast her chair fell over and said we'd regret crossing her daughter before storming out. That night, I found Jake on his laptop looking at apartments in Denver and Seattle. He said maybe we should just move somewhere Hannah couldn't reach us and start fresh where nobody knew about any of this. I told him we weren't running away from my family because of Hannah, but he kept scrolling through listings anyway. 3 days later, Mom called and said Grandma Rose wanted everyone at Sunday dinner and it wasn't optional. We showed up to find the whole family there except Hannah and Diane, who'd been avoiding everyone since the meeting. Grandma stood up from her chair holding an old tape recorder and said she had something we all needed to hear. She pressed play, and Hannah's voice filled the room talking to someone about how she'd tracked our honeymoon through Mom's Facebook posts of our engagement party photos where we'd mentioned Italy. The recording went on with Hannah laughing about how she knew we'd give her money if she cried enough in public and made a scene. Mom's hand went to her mouth and Uncle Robert's face turned white as Hannah kept talking about all the times she'd taken money from Grandma's purse during visits. Grandma said she'd started recording after noticing cash going missing 2 years ago and had dozens of these tapes. We sat there listening to Hannah brag about the fake cancer scare and how she'd kept the wedding money for herself instead of paying the vendor like she'd promised. Uncle Robert stood up and walked out to the porch while Mom started crying and apologizing for not believing me sooner. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness watching my family finally understand what I'd been dealing with for years. Sophie grabbed my phone and said we needed to be smart about this recording and not post it anywhere until after the court date. She was right, because Hannah had already filed in small claims court for emotional distress and abandonment. 4 weeks passed with Hannah posting constantly about her trauma and starting another GoFundMe for therapy costs. The court date finally came and Hannah showed up with printed Instagram posts and some woman she'd met online who claimed to be a disability advocate but had never actually met Hannah before that day. Hannah stood up and told the judge she'd developed severe anxiety from our abandonment in Florence and needed compensation for her medical bills. The judge asked for documentation of her anxiety diagnosis from before the Italy incident, but Hannah just kept saying we'd traumatized her. Jake handed our lawyer the folder with everything, including the cease and desist letter, the video from the Florence train station, Uncle Robert's email admitting Hannah had lied, and finally Grandma's recording. The courtroom went silent as Hannah's own voice played talking about her plan to follow us to Italy for easy vacation money. Hannah's face went from red to white as she heard herself laughing about manipulating us. She tried to tell the judge the recording was taken out of context and was illegally obtained without her consent. When that didn't work, she said she was just joking around, and we were too sensitive to understand her humor. The judge looked at her for a long moment, then said not only was he dismissing her case, but he was recommending we countersue for defamation and harassment. He also said he was referring the GoFundMe fraud to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation. Hannah started screaming that we'd set her up, and this was all a conspiracy to ruin her life. The bailiff had to physically escort her out while she kicked and tried to grab onto the doorframe, her designer purse spilling makeup and receipts across the floor. Outside on the courthouse steps, something changed in her face as she collapsed onto the concrete and started sobbing. Not the fake tears she'd used 1,000 times before, but real, ugly crying with snot running down her face. Her shoulders shook as she kept saying she didn't mean for it to go this far. Jake and I walked past her toward the parking lot where Aunt was leaning against her car looking older than I'd ever seen her. She looked at us with empty eyes and said quietly that she'd always known what Hannah was doing. She admitted she thought if everyone just gave in, it would be easier than fighting her all the time. She touched my arm and apologized before getting in her car and driving away without even checking on Hannah. 6 weeks passed and Sophie showed me screenshots people had been sending her from Hannah's now deleted blog and Instagram. Hannah had wiped everything clean, but dozens of people had already saved the evidence of her lies about the Italy trip. The screenshots showed her claiming I'd invited her and then abandoned her when she got sick. One post even said Jake had made inappropriate comments to her, which made me want to throw my phone. That night, Jake and I ordered Chinese food and watched a movie without checking our phones once for the first time in weeks. He squeezed my hand and told me we'd survived the worst of it, and I actually believed him. The next morning, Sophie filed the countersuit she'd been preparing with documentation of everything, including Jake's missed work and our therapy bills. She was seeking $30,000 in damages using the same legal tactics Hannah had tried on us. Within 2 days, Hannah had created at least 4 fake Facebook accounts that started posting in local mom groups. The posts claimed I was pregnant and hormonal, which explained why I was attacking my mentally ill cousin who just needed help. She even posted fake ultrasound photos she'd found online saying I was hiding the pregnancy because I was ashamed. People started congratulating Jake at work, which is how we found out about the posts in the first place. Meanwhile, the GoFundMe investigation wrapped up with a letter stating donors could request full refunds within 30 days. Hannah had already spent most of the $4,000 she'd raised and now had to pay it back somehow. The letter also mentioned potential fraud charges if she couldn't return the money, which meant possible jail time. Mom invited me for coffee at the little place near her house and spent 20 minutes apologizing with tears in her eyes. She admitted she'd always given Hannah more attention because she seemed to need more help than me. She realized now she'd been enabling a monster and felt sick about all the times she'd asked me to be the bigger person. While we were talking, she got a call from Uncle who was screaming so loud I could hear him through the phone. He'd been going through his business credit card statements and found $15,000 in charges he didn't recognize. When he dug deeper, he discovered Hannah had been using his card number for 2 years, buying clothes and trips including her Florence tickets. He found receipts for designer bags and spa treatments, all charged to his construction company account that she'd somehow gotten access to. 2 months had passed since we'd gotten back from Italy, when Uncle officially pressed charges for credit card fraud and identity theft. My phone rang at 11 that night with Hannah screaming that I'd destroyed her entire life and turned everyone against her. I let the call go to voicemail and hit record on my phone as her messages kept coming through that night, each one getting worse as she threatened to destroy my marriage and make sure I never had peace again. The next morning, Mom called to tell me Aunt Diane was defending Hannah completely, while the rest of the family had finally had enough and were setting boundaries after years of dealing with her drama. Jake watched me pace around our apartment for days and finally sat me down to suggest we try therapy together, since this wasn't just about Hannah, but about understanding why my family let this pattern continue for so long. 3 weeks later, we were sitting in a therapist's office on the north side of Chicago, where the therapist explained that Hannah showed classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder, and my family's constant enabling had created the perfect conditions for her behavior to escalate over the years. I was checking my email during a work break when I saw a message from someone named Rachel, who said she'd been Hannah's college roommate and had stories about Hannah faking cancer for attention and money, plus she was willing to testify if we needed her. Rachel showing up with college stories now makes me wonder why she's coming forward after all this time. Something about the timing feels too convenient when Hannah's already facing fraud charges and everyone's finally seeing through her act. Within days of Rachel reaching out, my inbox started filling up with messages from other people who'd dealt with Hannah over the years, including a high school friend she'd accused of theft, a co-worker she'd gotten fired with false harassment claims, and an ex-boyfriend she'd stalked for months. Sitting at my kitchen table 10 weeks after we'd gotten back from Italy, I mapped out all these stories on paper and realized Hannah had been pulling these stunts for over a decade, and we were just the first ones who'd fought back with actual evidence. Sophie called me laughing when the defamation case moved forward, because Hannah's court-appointed lawyer had suggested we settle, but Sophie pointed out Hannah had no money and no leverage to negotiate with. Grandma invited Jake and me over for dinner at her house in Lincoln Park, where she told us she was proud of us for standing up to Hannah since she'd been too old and tired to fight, but we'd done what needed doing. 2 days after that dinner, Hannah sent a group text to the entire family claiming she was pregnant, and the stress we'd caused might harm the baby, but even Aunt Diane's response seemed skeptical this time. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and the number showed the state attorney's office. The prosecutor told me they'd reviewed all the evidence from Hannah's GoFundMe scheme and were filing criminal fraud charges. She could face up to 2 years in prison if convicted. I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the kitchen floor. Jake came running in, and I put the call on speaker so he could hear. The prosecutor explained they had enough evidence from the fake medical documents and forged signatures to make a solid case. 3 months dragged by with Hannah still posting about her pregnancy on social media. She uploaded old ultrasound photos she'd stolen from pregnancy websites and kept asking for baby shower gifts. Then Aunt Diane called me crying one afternoon. She'd finally forced Hannah to go to a doctor appointment with her. There was no pregnancy and never had been. The doctor ran tests and confirmed Hannah hadn't been pregnant in years. Aunt Diane kept saying she didn't know what to do anymore and that Hannah needed professional help. The criminal case moved through the system like molasses. Court dates got pushed back and rescheduled constantly. Hannah's public defender called me 6 weeks later to discuss a plea deal they'd offered her. She could avoid prison with 3 years probation, full restitution to all victims, and mandatory psychological treatment. It seemed too good for what she'd done, but at least it was something. That same week, Jake's boss called him into the office. The HR investigation was officially closed and all of Hannah's claims had been proven false. His boss apologized for the stress and offered Jake 2 extra weeks of paid time off. Jake came home that night looking like someone had lifted a truck off his shoulders. I had to go to the courthouse to file some paperwork for the civil suit the following Tuesday. Walking down the hallway, I almost ran straight into Hannah coming out of a meeting room. She looked smaller somehow with dark circles under her eyes and her hair unwashed. For just a second, I felt bad for her. Then she leaned close and whispered that this wasn't over. Her lawyer rushed over and pulled her away before I could respond. 2 days later, the prosecutor called to tell me Hannah had rejected the plea deal. She wanted a trial where she could tell her side of the story. Her lawyer had tried to talk sense into her, but she'd started screaming about representing herself. The prosecutor said the lawyer looked ready to quit right there in the conference room. The family group chat that had been dead for months suddenly exploded with messages from Aunt Diane. She was begging everyone to convince Hannah to take the plea deal. She kept writing that Hannah would go to prison if she went to trial. Nobody responded to any of her messages. Jake and I needed a break from all the drama, so we drove up to Michigan for a long weekend 4 months after we'd gotten back from Italy. We stayed at a little cabin near the lake and didn't check our phones or social media once. It was the first time we'd really relaxed since the honeymoon disaster. Sophie called the minute we got home with news about the case. The trial date was set for next month, but more importantly, 3 other people Hannah had scammed over the years had joined our civil suit. One was a former roommate she'd stolen rent money from, and another was an ex-boyfriend she'd taken loans from using fake medical bills. The third was her former boss who'd caught her embezzling. The next Thursday morning, I woke up to 47 missed calls and twice as many texts. Hannah had posted on Facebook at 3 in the morning saying she was going to kill herself because everyone had turned against her. Someone had called the police for a welfare check. They found her sitting on her couch eating ice cream and watching Netflix. The officers took her to the hospital anyway, and she was placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold for evaluation. During those 3 days at the hospital, the doctors ran a bunch of tests and evaluations on Hannah. The psychiatrist called Diane in for a meeting on day 2 and laid out everything they'd found. Hannah had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder, plus some other stuff I didn't fully understand. Diane sat there crying while the doctor explained that Hannah needed serious long-term treatment, not just family support. For the first time ever, However, Diane stopped making excuses and actually listened to what the professionals were saying. She signed the papers for Hannah to be transferred to a psychiatric facility for extended treatment after the hold ended. 5 months passed with Hannah in and out of treatment programs while the legal stuff moved forward. The criminal trial for the fraud charges finally started in March, and Hannah showed up to court wearing this super conservative outfit. She had on a navy blue suit with her hair pulled back in a bun, trying to look like a church lady or something. The prosecutor had done his homework though, and he'd found everything Hannah had ever posted online about the Italy situation. On the third day of trial, Hannah took the stand and immediately started contradicting herself left and right. She told the jury she'd been abandoned in Florence and left to fend for herself without any money. Then 10 minutes later, she said she'd chosen to stay behind for a spa day, and we'd just misunderstood the plans. The prosecutor pulled up her Facebook posts from that week showing her asking for emergency donations because we'd left her stranded. Then he showed her Instagram stories from the same day claiming she was having the time of her life exploring Florence solo. He had screenshots of her GoFundMe page where she'd raised $8,000 for her emergency situation in Italy. The jury members were taking notes and shaking their heads as more evidence kept coming out. Hannah's blog posts from the trip showed her planning to crash our honeymoon weeks before she even left for Europe. She'd written about how she deserved a free vacation and how family should always help family no matter what. The prosecutor presented bank records showing she'd withdrawn $10,000 from her savings the day before claiming to be broke in Florence. Her own social media campaigns condemning us for abandoning her were used as evidence of intentional fraud and defamation. By the time closing arguments came around, Hannah's lawyer looked defeated and barely put up a defense. The jury went to deliberate and came back in just 2 hours with their verdict. When they read guilty on all fraud charges, Hannah jumped up and screamed that we'd ruined an innocent person's life. The bailiff had to physically restrain her as she tried to lunge toward our side of the courtroom. A week later, we were back for sentencing, and the judge let multiple victims give impact statements about Hannah's behavior. Her ex-boyfriend from college talked about how she'd stalked him for 2 years after their breakup. A former coworker described how Hannah had gotten her fired by spreading lies about her stealing from the company. Jake and I gave our statement about the honeymoon incident and all the family events she'd ruined over the years. The judge asked Hannah if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing, and she went on this 20-minute rant. She claimed everyone was jealous of her and that we'd all conspired to frame her for things she didn't do. The judge cut her off and said, "Ms. Hannah, you've shown no remorse and no acknowledgement of harm caused." He sentenced her to 18 months in minimum security prison, 3 years of probation after release, mandatory mental health treatment, and $50,000 in restitution. The restitution would be split between all the victims who'd given statements, including the people who donated to her fake GoFundMe. Diane completely broke down when the bailiff put handcuffs on Hannah and started leading her away. Hannah's face went white as reality hit her that she was actually going to jail for this. She looked back at her mom with real fear in her eyes for the first time I'd ever seen. Outside the courthouse, Mom pulled me into the tightest hug and whispered that she was sorry she didn't protect me from Hannah sooner. The rest of the family gathered around us, and for the first time in years, nobody was arguing about taking sides. 6 months passed before the civil suit finally wrapped up, and the check arrived for barely enough to cover our lawyer fees, plus the therapy sessions Jake and I had started going to twice a week. The therapist's office had these ugly brown chairs that reminded me of my elementary school, but sitting there helped us work through everything that had happened. Mom started coming to some sessions with us, and even Grandma joined a few times, though she spent most of the time telling the therapist how she should have seen the signs with Hannah years ago. 18 months in minimum security for years of fraud feels like getting detention for burning down the school. Hannah's lawyer probably celebrated losing this case because defending her was harder than explaining why water is wet. Uncle showed up once, sat in the corner crying for 20 minutes, then left without saying much. The prison mail started arriving about 3 months into Hannah's sentence, thick envelopes with her prisoner number stamped on the outside. I opened the first one thinking maybe she'd finally apologize, but it was just 4 pages asking for commissary money and complaining about the food. I threw it straight in the trash and went online to block her from the prisoner email system they apparently have now. Diane texted me a week later asking if we could meet for coffee to talk about rebuilding our relationship. I texted back that I'd consider it when she stopped telling people Hannah was innocent and framed. She replied with a long message about how I didn't understand a mother's love, so I blocked her number too. By November, we decided to host Thanksgiving at our place for the first time. Just Mom, Grandma, Uncle, and Sophie with her husband. Nobody mentioned Hannah's name the entire meal, and Uncle actually smiled when Jake brought out the turkey he'd been working on since 5 that morning. Sophie called me the next week saying some law school had asked her to speak at a conference about our case, since it had become this weird example of how social media harassment connects to fraud charges. She sent me the PowerPoint slides later, and seeing our story laid out in bullet points felt strange but also kind of validating. Jake's boss pulled him aside in January to tell him he was getting promoted to senior manager, joking that anyone who could handle what Jake went through with my family could handle any corporate crisis. We celebrated with takeout Chinese food and watched old episodes of The Office, both of us finally able to laugh about things again. Our first wedding anniversary came in March, and we booked the same hotels in Florence and Venice we'd stayed at before, except this time we didn't tell anyone until we got back and posted the photos. The trip was quiet and perfect, just eating pasta and walking around without looking over our shoulders every 5 minutes. I started writing a blog in April about dealing with toxic family members, mostly just practical stuff about setting boundaries and recognizing manipulation tactics. Within a month, I had 3,000 subscribers and dozens of messages from people dealing with their own Hannahs. The prison letters kept coming every few weeks, but I had a system now where I just wrote "return to sender" without opening them. Mom mentioned once that Diane had tried to organize a support group for Hannah, but only 2 people showed up, and one was a reporter. Grandma's health started declining in May, and she made me promise to keep the family together the right way after she was gone, squeezing my hand with her thin fingers. fingers. By June, 6 months into Hannah's sentence, I realized I hadn't thought about her in days. Jake and I put an offer on a house with a big backyard and a spare room we could turn into an office. Mom came over every Sunday for dinner and helped me plant tomatoes in containers on our apartment balcony while we waited for the house closing. The restraining order paperwork sat in our filing cabinet ready for when Hannah gets released in a few years, but I didn't check the dates anymore. Sophie's conference presentation apparently went viral in legal circles, and she got 3 job offers from it. Uncle started dating someone new, a teacher who'd never heard of Hannah, and brought her to our 4th of July barbecue where she fit right in with our smaller but healthier family. The blog grew to 10,000 subscribers, and a publisher reached out about turning it into a book, though I wasn't sure I wanted to relive everything in that much detail. Jake and I started planning for kids, something we'd put on hold during all the chaos. Grandma passed away in her sleep in August, 2 days after telling me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, and that Hannah had made her own choices. The funeral was small and peaceful, just family who actually cared about each other instead of drama and scenes. Diane showed up at the church but sat in the back and left without trying to talk to anyone. 2 weeks later, the house closing went through and we spent our first night on an air mattress in the empty living room, eating pizza and talking about paint colors. Mom helped us move the next weekend, organizing the kitchen while Jake and Uncle assembled furniture. I found one last letter from Hannah in our mail forwarding and threw it away unopened like all the others. Life felt normal in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Just regular problems like picking curtains and figuring out lawnmower settings instead of constant crisis management. The family was definitely smaller now, but every gathering felt genuine instead of walking on eggshells waiting for the next explosion. Hannah would get out eventually, but we were ready with our boundaries and legal protections. And more importantly, we'd learned that keeping toxic people around just to avoid conflict only leads to bigger problems. The blog became my side project, helping other people recognize the patterns I'd missed for so long, and every message from someone who'd finally gone no contact with their own toxic relative reminded me we'd made the right choice. Jake got another promotion 6 months later and joked that his new title should include Family Crisis Survivor on his business cards. We painted the spare room yellow and started trying for a baby, finally ready to build something new without the shadow of Hannah's chaos hanging over everything. The story of the ruined honeymoon became something we could actually laugh about at dinner parties, though we always left out the darkest parts. Mom and I grew closer than we'd ever been, talking honestly about how we'd both enabled Hannah for years out of misguided family loyalty. Uncle sent Hannah one letter telling her he loved her, but couldn't have her in his life anymore until she got real help, not the fake apologies she'd always used before. Sophie's legal career took off and she became the go-to expert on social media fraud cases, often citing our case as the perfect storm of narcissism meeting technology. Our new neighbors had no idea about any of the drama, just knew us as the friendly couple who brought cookies when they moved in. The restraining order paperwork got updated with our new address, but otherwise stayed filed away. I realized one day while planting roses in our backyard that I hadn't checked Hannah's release date in months and didn't feel the need to. The family we'd built from the ashes of the old dysfunction was smaller but stronger, based on respect and genuine love instead of obligation and fear. Hannah had actually done us a favor in a twisted way by showing us exactly what happens when you prioritize keeping the peace over protecting yourself from toxic behavior. Jake and I made a promise to each other that our kids would never have to deal with that kind of manipulation, that we'd teach them the difference between real family and people who just share DNA. The blog turned into a book deal I finally accepted, with all proceeds going to a charity that helps stalking victims. Life moved forward in all the normal, beautiful ways it's supposed to, when you're not constantly in crisis mode. And even though Hannah would always be out there somewhere, she'd lost her power over us completely. Thanks for letting me wonder along with you through all of this. Keep questioning everything out there, and I'll see you next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.